What if I told you there was a wife even Henry VIII feared? A woman so cunning, her name was deliberately erased from royal records, her portraits destroyed, her tomb unmarked. For centuries, historians dismissed her as rumour. But recently uncovered letters reveal something darker. A queen whose love curdled into obsession, whose secrets could have torn the Tudor throne apart. This isn't the tale of the wives you know. This is the one history buried. And for good reason. Stay until the end. Because her story doesn't end with her death. It begins there. The palace did not welcome her. It loomed, a labyrinth of gold and gloom, heavy with the breath of centuries. Every corridor seemed to listen. The walls were lined with portraits of queens who smiled too sweetly, their painted eyes dimmed by candle smoke. Even in daylight, shadows clung to the ceilings like cobwebs spun from fear. Here, laughter was rare, and truth was a currency too costly to spend. The winter wind pressed against the stained glass windows, and the river below creaked beneath its own frozen skin. From her carriage window, she had seen London's torches flicker in the fog like dying stars. The people cheered her name that night, though most did not know her face. They had seen too many brides pass through these gates to believe any would last. Inside, the air shimmered with the sweetness of beeswax and the rot of old secrets. Courtiers bowed low as she entered the great hall, their smiles polished, their eyes weighing her worth. Jewels caught the firelight, reflecting every false allegiance. Somewhere among them, her future waited, shaped not by destiny, but by appetite. Henry watched from the dais, a silhouette wrapped in crimson. His gaze was steady, hungry, calculating. He had known love before, and grief, and rage. But what he saw in her was something that thrilled him, a reflection of his own power softened by grace. He would call it love. Others would call it another sentence. She curtsied, her gown whispering across the floor like a sigh. The orchestra resumed its gentle pulse, and for a moment the court pretended to breathe again. Yet behind every toast, every polished phrase, danger stirred. The king's moods were a kingdom of their own, unpredictable, shifting as tides. That night, from her new chamber, she looked out at the snow gathering on the parapets. The city below slept, unaware of the quiet storm now sealed behind palace walls. Her maid lit a single candle, and in that small circle of light, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Young, serene, unprepared. But beneath her calm exterior, something moved, a flicker of instinct, a whisper that told her beauty was no shield, and affection no protection. This was not a home, but a stage, and every player who stepped upon it left a stain. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly. Footsteps faded. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, though the room was empty. Only the tapestry moved, stirred by an unseen draught. The candle trembled, its flame bending toward her as if drawn by breath. She reached to steady it, and in that moment she understood. The palace was alive. It watched, it remembered, it devoured. And as the last ember of the candle hissed into smoke, she whispered the words no one would ever record. Let them forget me. Before the palace walls swallowed her name, she had belonged to another world, quieter, simpler, but already restless with dreams too large for its fields. Her childhood home stood at the edge of the countryside, where meadows bled into mist and the air smelled faintly of iron and lilies. Her father was a man of modest title and immense ambition, the kind who smiled at opportunity, but never at his children. Her mother, pale and cautious, taught her the art of silence, the kind that could open doors when words could not. She had grown up among books and whispers, watching courtiers visit, listening to their talk of London and the king who broke his wives as easily as promises. Even then, she understood the currency of charm. While other girls practiced embroidery, she studied expressions, the tilt of a smile, the hesitation in a glance. Beauty was an instrument, and she learned to play it perfectly. Her hair was the color of chestnuts caught in sunlight, her eyes dark with curiosity rather than fear. Portraitists tried to capture her likeness, but always missed something, that glint of calculation beneath innocence. She was not cruel, at least not yet, But ambition had already begun to whisper its lullabies, soft and convincing. When Henry's envoys first arrived, her family reacted as though heaven itself had knocked on their door. Servants ran through corridors, polishing silver that had long forgotten its shine. Letters were written, prayers offered. She, however, remained still, watching the commotion as though it were happening in another life. She knew what this summons meant, and she also knew she could never return unchanged. At court, her first meeting with the king was not what the poets later imagined. There were no gasps, no thunderstruck silences. Just two people who recognized something familiar in one another, the hunger for significance. He spoke gently, his words measured, his smile rehearsed. She answered with poise, neither flattered nor afraid. That was what caught him. Her composure. She was the calm after his tempests, the mirror that reflected his grandeur without question. Rumor spread quickly, as it always did. Some said she bewitched him with a single glance. Others whispered she reminded him of one he had lost. To her, it did not matter. Love was a story for poets. She sought survival. If affection came, it would be a luxury. Yet, in the stillness of night, when the torches guttered, and the scent of roses crept through her window, she sometimes allowed herself to dream. Not of crowns or jewels, but of safety. A place where she would not have to measure her words, where no one's favor decided her fate. But the wind outside carried only the echo of the city, restless and cold. That small yearning within her heart was the first thing the palace would take. The wedding unfolded like a vision painted on glass, brilliant, fragile, destined to crack. The bells of the abbey tolled until the air itself seemed to vibrate. London streets overflowed with bodies, faces lifted toward the winter sun, eyes dazzled by the pageantry. They cheered for love, though everyone knew this ceremony was not about devotion, but control. She arrived at the altar veiled in white, so fine it shimmered like frost. Beneath it, her breath came shallow, each step echoing louder than the choir. The scent of incense hung heavy, mingling with the metallic tang of candle smoke. Every sound, every gesture was ritual. The ring, the vow, the gaze that met hers like a brand pressed to skin. Henry's voice, deep and solemn, filled the vaults. When he placed his hand upon hers, she felt not warmth, but weight. For the spectators, it was perfection. A king redeemed, a bride radiant. The court whispered approval behind jeweled fans. Yet amid the applause, she noticed faces turned away, lips tightening, eyes refusing to meet hers. There were ghosts in the pews, not specters, but memories of women who had stood there before her. That night, as the celebration continued, musicians played until their fingers trembled. Cups overflowed. Dancers twirled beneath chandeliers that dripped with glass and wax. She sat beside Henry, her smile flawless, her silence unbroken. When he leaned close, promising her eternity, she wondered if eternity ever ended well within these walls. Her chamber was transformed into a shrine of gold and velvet. Petals carpeted the floor, pearls adorned her pillow. Yet nothing could soften the stillness that settled once the last attendant bowed and left. The laughter from the banquet drifted through the door, faint as a dying star. Alone, she removed her crown, feeling its impression still pressed into her skin. The moonlight touched the floor in silver bands. She crossed the room, her gown whispering like wings. In the mirror stood not a bride, but a stranger. Eyes too calm, smile too practiced. She reached out, half expecting the reflection to vanish. It didn't. It stared back, resolute, older than she remembered being that morning. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the courtyard in white. She watched the flakes melt upon the window pane, wondering how something so pure could dissolve so easily. Below, guards changed posts, their armor glinting like small, moving stars. The music faded, replaced by the dull rhythm of boots against stone. In that sound, she heard the truth of her union. Not promise, but vigilance. From this night onward, she would be both adored and observed, crowned and caged. And as the last candle dimmed, she whispered to her reflection, the play begins. The first weeks of her queenship passed in a blur of ceremony and calculation. Each day brought another audience, another performance. At the long oak table, gilded platters gleamed beneath chandeliers, and laughter rippled like water over stone. But beneath the glittering surface, unease simmered. Conversations halted when she entered. Smiles resumed half a second too late. She noticed details others ignored. The way courtiers leaned together to whisper behind goblets, how servants exchanged looks when Henry's mood shifted. There was a rhythm to the court's tension, a silent code she was learning to read. Even the air seemed cautious, heavy with unsaid truths. The king had begun to grow restless again. His affection came in bursts, extravagant gifts, sudden tenderness, then long absences filled with unexplained silences. When he spoke to her now, his words carried a weight she could not name. Once she had believed she could steady him. Now she understood that no one truly could. At the evening feast, the mood turned brittle. The courtiers performed their flattery with the precision of soldiers marching toward a familiar battle. A foreign ambassador toasted her beauty, and Henry smiled too widely. The hall went quiet. She met the king's gaze, unreadable, almost pitying. The ambassador's glass trembled slightly before it met his lips. Later, when the guests had gone, she lingered in the candle-lit silence of the hall. A stray violin note echoed from somewhere distant, drawn out and hollow. The scent of roasted meat still clung to the air, mingled with wine and wax. She reached out, trailing her fingers across the table's edge, feeling the grooves left by generations of kings. Power, she thought, always left scars, even on wood. From the doorway, her lady-in-waiting appeared, pale and hesitant. "Your Majesty," she whispered, glancing down the corridor before stepping closer. "You should be careful of those who smile too much." The queen studied her, young, frightened, loyal in the way frightened people often are. She gave a small nod. "I already am." In the days that followed, she began to notice small shifts. A missing letter, a servant dismissed without cause, a door that closed when she approached. At night, faint music drifted from distant chambers where she was not invited. She started sleeping with the curtains drawn, though even that did not keep out the feeling of eyes. Once, she found a wilted rose placed on her pillow. No note, no explanation. Its petals were nearly black, the stem wet as though freshly cut. She burned it in the hearth before dawn. By the end of that week, the laughter at supper had changed. It no longer sounded like mirth, more like the echo of something pretending to be alive. And when Henry's hand brushed hers at the table, she felt nothing of love, only the faint chill of warning. The palace, once a marvel, had turned into a masquerade, and somewhere behind the masks, her story was already darkening. Morning arrived later now, or so it seemed to her. The light that entered her chambers no longer carried warmth. It slid across the floor in narrow streaks, thin as knife edges. Servants moved quietly, careful not to disturb her, as they adjusted curtains and polished mirrors. She hardly spoke to them anymore. Even her reflection felt like a stranger, poised, immaculate, but hollow behind the eyes. The crown had not merely adorned her, it had altered her. Every glance, every curtsy, every whisper reminded her that she was no longer a woman, but a symbol wearing a heartbeat. There was no corner of the palace untouched by expectation. Her words carried consequences. Her silences bred suspicion. Somewhere between duty and devotion, something within her began to fracture. Henry's affection, once dazzling, had cooled into calculation. He visited when it suited him, leaving her with empty compliments and colder nights. In his absence, she wandered the galleries lined with portraits of his past loves. Their painted faces blurred together, pale, perfect, haunted. The painters had captured their beauty, but not their fear. She understood now what the artists had not dared to show, the way devotion could become a cage. She began to cultivate control where she could. A carefully chosen ally here, a dismissed servant there. Her kindness became selective, her smiles deliberate. People mistook her composure for serenity, never realizing it was strategy. She studied the women of court, how they flattered, how they listened, how they survived. Power, she realized, was not seized in the throne room. It was earned in the pauses between words. But isolation carried its own poison. She started to distrust the laughter in the corridors, the gestures of sympathy that felt rehearsed. Even the tapestries seemed to conceal faces that watched her in stillness. At night, the wind pressed against the windows like a whispering crowd. Her mind, once sharp and sure, began to echo with possibilities too dark to dismiss. Letters arrived without seals, unsigned. Phrases written in a familiar hand, but offering no comfort. They envy you. They wait for your fall. She burned them one by one, yet the ashes stayed with her, clinging to her fingers. Gradually, her reflection changed again. There was a tension around her mouth, an alertness in her gaze. She had learned that survival required something colder than love. Patience, calculation, and the willingness to be feared. One evening, as torches flickered in the courtyard below, she stood by the window and whispered to the snow, "Let them watch." In that moment, she no longer felt small within the palace. The walls, the eyes, even the crown, they no longer intimidated her. They belonged to her now, or at least she had learned to wear them as armor. The transformation was complete. She was not the bride who trembled beneath silk anymore. She was becoming the queen the stories would later condemn. Power, once tasted, demanded to be fed. It crept into her decisions quietly at first, a subtle tilt of favor, a sentence delayed, a punishment softened or sharpened according to her will. The courtiers did not notice the change immediately, but the servants did. Orders that once came gently now arrived like verdicts. Those who faltered under her gaze rarely remained in the palace for long. Her composure hardened into ritual. Each morning began with a stillness that unnerved her attendants. She would sit motionless while they dressed her, as if carved from marble, her thoughts moving behind her eyes like shadows beneath glass. The air around her began to change. Conversations quieted when she entered. Laughter wilted mid-breath. She did not mind. Silence, she discovered, was a form of obedience. Henry's visits grew rarer. When he appeared, she met him not with affection, but with poise so absolute it unsettled him. He had built this throne from desire and domination, but she had learned to master both. When he spoke of loyalty, she spoke of legacy. When he demanded love, she offered devotion measured in calculation. Her control frightened him, though he would never admit it. One afternoon, a rumor reached her. A lady of the court had spoken her name with disdain during supper. The insult was small, forgettable, but it reached her ears like a spark landing in dry grass. The next morning, that same woman found her privileges revoked, her family petition denied, her position erased as if she had never existed. The lesson spread faster than fear itself. The queen's patience was not infinite, yet beneath that frost, a pulse of longing still lived. Some nights she wandered the gardens alone, her hands brushing over the winter branches, remembering what it had felt like to belong to herself. The moonlight traced her features softly, a reminder that gentleness was not weakness, merely something she no longer had the luxury to show. Her enemies multiplied in silence, but so did her reach. Men who once dismissed her as ornamental now weighed every word before speaking in her presence. They did not realize that the same charm, which once served to please, now served to conceal. Behind every smile, she gathered information. Behind every polite nod, she built a web. By the time anyone understood the depth of her influence, it was already too late. Letters she had dictated shaped decisions across the kingdom. Favors she granted bound noblemen to her cause. The crown upon her head was no longer his symbol. It had become her instrument. In the flicker of candlelight, she would sometimes catch her reflection in the window. Not a woman, not yet a monster, but something sharpened by survival. Her heart still beat, though it now kept time with ambition rather than love. She whispered to the silence, "They made me necessary." And in that truth, she found a kind of peace more enduring than forgiveness. By sunrise, her name was gone. Orders came quietly, sealed in red wax, and delivered before the court awoke. Servants were told to burn her gowns, to strike her crest from every wall, to melt the ring she had touched. The portraits were taken down one by one, their eyes covered first, as if even painted gazes could accuse. Within hours, the woman who had once ruled beside a king no longer existed in word or relic. The palace adjusted quickly. New tapestries were hung to conceal the pale shapes left behind by her likeness. Musicians changed their songs, omitting verses she had favoured. Even the hounds she had fed were led away, their collars buried in the garden earth. To the few who dared to whisper, her absence was explained with polite uncertainty. She departed, or she was unwell. But beneath those careful phrases spread a different rumour, that the Queen's heart had turned too dark to rest, and the king had ordered silence to contain what lingered. The records followed next. Clerks crossed through her entries, scraped her signature from letters, and rewrote dates to close the gaps her presence had left. Every trace of her penmanship was treated like infection. When the royal chronicler refused to alter his pages, he was sent north, his manuscript confiscated. The next edition bore no mention of her. For the court, the change was a relief. Fear works best when it leaves no proof. The courtiers smiled wider, their bows deeper, eager to show they remembered nothing. A season passed, then another, until the air itself seemed to forget her voice. Only the walls remained honest. In the long gallery, where her laughter had once travelled like light, small marks remained. Scratches where her jewels had brushed the plaster, a faint stain near the window where a goblet had fallen. They were harmless signs to most, but the maids avoided that room after dusk. One night, a young servant carrying candles swore she heard someone humming in the darkness, the tune from a feast no one else recalled. She dropped her tray and fled, leaving wax pooled like melted stars across the floor. The next morning, the king walked that corridor alone. He paused before the bare space where her portrait had once hung, tracing the outline left by time and smoke. Whatever thought crossed his face, it vanished before anyone could see. Then he turned away and ordered the corridor sealed. And so she vanished, not in fire or blood, but in revision. Her life rewritten until only the silence of her absence remained. For years, no one dared to speak her name aloud. It drifted instead through locked rooms and dim corridors, carried by servants who could not sleep. The palace was quieter now, but quiet does not mean peace. It means listening. And in that stillness, faint sounds began to return. A lady-in-waiting, dismissed without cause, began to tell her story in candle-lit kitchens. She said she had seen the Queen writing after midnight, not letters to the king, but to someone else. Her words, written in hurried lines across thin paper, spoke of betrayal, of things hidden behind chapel doors. The listener swore the ink smelled faintly of iron. Another tale came from a guard who had served outside her chamber. He claimed that on the last night before she vanished, a visitor entered her rooms, cloaked, unannounced, unrecorded. The man stayed for less than an hour. When he left, the Queen's candle still burned, though her window stood open to the storm. In the villages beyond London, old women repeated stranger versions. They said the Queen's heart had been buried in secret, sealed in a silver box engraved with thorns. They said her spirit followed the man who betrayed her, whispering in his ear until his hair turned white. No one could prove it, but proof had ceased to matter. A monk at Canterbury wrote of a confession taken from a dying maid. The maid, delirious, spoke of a hidden chest beneath the palace chapel, lined with her mistress's letters, each sealed in red wax. The monk sent word to the crown, but his letter was intercepted. He disappeared before the month's end. Scholars centuries later would call these stories phantoms of gossip, yet too many details aligned. The same phrases recurred: a silver locket, a forgotten melody, the colour of the Queen's final dress. Each fragment matched another, like scattered pieces of a broken seal, and through all of them ran a single unnerving thread. The suggestion that her vanishing had not been sudden at all, that she had foreseen it, perhaps even arranged it. Some letters hinted she left behind a message meant for the one man who could never receive it. By the time Henry grew old, even his most trusted scribes avoided the subject. Yet in one surviving ledger, hidden between tax records, a single note remains. The rose is cut, but the root endures. Who wrote it, no one knows. But it was written in her hand, the same ink, the same elegant stroke. And with that, her silence began to stir again, centuries after her body was dust, whispering from pages that refused to stay blank. Centuries passed before her shadow surfaced again. Time had covered her tracks with dust, but dust does not destroy. It preserves. In the winter of 1894, a restoration team working beneath Hampton Court discovered a boarded passage sealed since Henry's reign. Behind it lay a room barely large enough to stand in, lined with warped oak panels, and a single chair turned to the wall. Nothing else, except a sliver of canvas wedged behind a beam. When the painting was unrolled, it revealed only part of a woman's face, a pale cheek, a fragment of lace, the faint trace of a smile. No record matched it, yet pigment analysis placed its creation within the same years her existence had been erased. Scholars dismissed it as coincidence, but one historian noticed the necklace around the painted neck, a silver pendant shaped like a rose with a hidden thorn. Months later, an archivist cataloguing royal correspondence uncovered a small envelope misfiled in the papers of Edward VI. Inside was a torn page written in a feminine hand, the ink faded but legible. If truth is to survive, it must hide among lies. The handwriting matched no known consort, except one whose records had been deliberately destroyed. The discovery ignited fascination. Researchers scoured monastic libraries, country estates, even private family archives. A pattern emerged. Brief mentions of a queen unnamed, her initials scratched out, her story reduced to ellipses in the margins. Each omission formed part of a larger silence, deliberate and precise. Then, in a museum in York, a curator restoring an antique locket found a hair strand sealed beneath glass, auburn, perfectly preserved. Etched inside the cover, barely visible under corrosion, was a single word: remember. DNA testing could not confirm its origin, yet the mystery became an obsession. Documentaries speculated. Academics debated. Some dismissed her as a myth created from collective guilt. Others believed the evidence too aligned to ignore. And in that debate, her presence returned, not as a ghost, but as a question. Who decides what history forgets? The final breakthrough came when a private collection in France released a ledger belonging to a Tudor envoy. Within it, one entry stood apart from political notes, a brief line written in Latin: "She lives, though none must see her." What it meant remains uncertain. Was it metaphor? A hidden exile? A symbolic resurrection? Whatever the truth, it fractured the illusion of her erasure. Because once silence is broken, even by a whisper, it cannot be restored. And after centuries of denial, the woman the king tried to erase was no longer a rumor. She had become a mystery too visible to ignore. When the last archive closed and the scholars went home, what lingered was not certainty, but a feeling. Her story, fractured and incomplete, seemed to hum beneath the surface of every document touched by time. Nothing whole remained, yet something undeniably alive pressed through the cracks, like roots beneath stone. In the museum light, the half-portrait looked almost human again. The pigments, though dulled by centuries, caught a glint of warmth whenever the sun reached the glass. Visitors paused before it, not because they recognized her, but because they sensed she had once mattered, that she had felt, suffered, and vanished in ways too deliberate to be mere chance. Historians argued over titles and lineage, but ordinary people felt the deeper weight, the grief of being unwritten. They saw in her a reflection of every name history had softened into silence. The women whose brilliance threatened order, whose tenderness frightened power. Her mystery became a mirror for their own. Letters continued to appear, copies, interpretations, even forgeries. Yet in every retelling, she grew less ghostly and more human. Not the monster whispered about in taverns, not the saint some wished to redeem, but a woman trapped in the crossfire of a kingdom built on vanity and fear. Her truth was not in the relics, but in the persistence of her memory. Across England, the places once associated with her name seemed to stir again. In one abbey, restorers uncovered a carved rose tucked beneath the choir stalls, unrecorded, nearly invisible. In a private chapel in Kent, a candle burned down to its base and revealed initials etched into the metal holder, faint but unmistakable. Some said these were coincidences. Others swore it was history whispering back. And perhaps that is all legacy truly is. Not monuments or chronicles, but the echoes that refuse to fade. The king's descendants would continue to rule, their portraits polished, their triumphs gilded. Yet behind their splendor remained that silent space, the one blank in every lineage chart, the name that should have been there but isn't. That absence speaks louder than marble. Today, her face is still debated, her story disputed. But her absence, that carefully engineered emptiness, has become her immortality. The harder they tried to erase her, the deeper she etched herself into time. No plaque bears her name, no anthem sings her sorrow. But when the palace corridors darken and the wind stirs the tapestries, a faint rustle breaks the stillness, as though memory itself refuses to rest. What remained of her was not a body, not a crown, not a grave, only the echo of defiance, the quiet victory of a woman the world was never meant to remember. The older Henry became, the quieter the palace grew. The halls that had once trembled beneath his commands now seemed to breathe against him, like a creature remembering an old wound. Even the servants spoke in murmurs, as if sound itself might provoke the ghosts he tried not to believe in. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it arrived like punishment. His dreams were not of war or glory, but of corridors stretching endlessly, door after door, opening into the same room. Empty, candlelight flickering against a single chair turned toward the wall. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced someone had just stepped out of sight. Physicians blamed the fevers that plagued him, the swelling of the leg, the rot of the flesh. They said it made him see things. But the visions were not born of illness. They were memories given shape. He began to speak to shadows. At first, quietly, as if reasoning with himself. Then louder, until the guards outside pretended not to hear. In one outburst, he ordered a painting to be covered, claiming its eyes followed him wherever he walked. The portrait depicted St. Catherine, but her gaze was too familiar, her mouth too knowing. During Mass, he would lose his place in prayer, pausing mid-verse to stare at the floor as though the stone beneath him were shifting. He complained of a scent that no one else detected, a trace of rose and smoke, faint yet persistent. One chaplain, emboldened by faith, told him it was the smell of forgiveness denied. The next morning, that man was reassigned to a monastery far from court. At night, Henry would summon his scribe to dictate confessions he never signed. Each began differently. Apologies, commands, prayers, but all ended with the same unfinished sentence. She deserved. The words trailed off, the ink blotting as his hand trembled. The parchments were later burned on his order, yet the ash lingered in the corners of the hearth, refusing to vanish. His courtiers learned not to mention the past, but silence only deepened the madness. When thunder broke over the river, he would shout her name, not in rage, but in plea, though even he could no longer say which name he meant. The king who once demanded obedience now lived surrounded by locked doors and candlelight that trembled before extinguishing itself. He told his confessor he feared no man, no God, only a woman's silence. And as his body failed, as flesh gave way to decay, that silence grew louder, not cruel, not vengeful, but steady. A reminder. A presence that would not release him, no matter how many prayers he offered or portraits he destroyed. Because what he had tried to erase had not vanished. It had simply learned to haunt. When Henry was finally gone, Whitehall did not rest. The courtiers spoke softly, relieved yet uneasy, as though the walls were still listening. The king's bedchamber was sealed, the tapestries drawn, the fires extinguished. But at night, a faint sound lingered. The slow, uneven tread of a man dragging one leg, echoing through corridors that should have been empty. No one claimed to see him, but the air shifted near that door, colder than the rest of the palace. Candles guttered for no reason. A dog refused to enter the chamber, howling at the threshold until it was carried away. Servants whispered that the king's soul wandered, searching for what he had broken. They said he mistook eternity for another throne room, and that even death would not let him rule alone. When Whitehall burned years later, flames devoured everything except the wing where he had died. The smoke curled upward like a dark crown, and witnesses swore they heard bells tolling, though none were rung. The fire spared his chamber, as if it too remembered fear. After the ruins cooled, builders avoided the place. They said the stone carried something that refused to fade, a sorrow too heavy for mortar to hold. When restoration began, strange things followed. Tools vanished overnight, scaffolds collapsed without wind, and one mason, driven by some unseen dread, leapt from the upper floor screaming of "a woman's whisper" in the plaster. No record named her. Yet through the years, visitors began to speak of a pale figure near the old garden gate. Not the king, but someone quieter. A shadow of silk gliding through mist, turning her head towards the window where he once prayed and trembled. Historians dismissed it as imagination. Still, the palace guides avoided that wing at dusk, claiming the air thickened, as if grief itself had taken form. One late watchman wrote that he heard footsteps pacing just beyond sight, and a faint voice murmuring a single phrase he could not understand, except that it ended with mercy. Time did not erase the sound. Even when Whitehall's remnants became only a story, that word remained, whispered by those who felt something brush past them on winter nights, as though history itself had unfinished business. And so, long after Henry's crown turned to dust, his empire of guilt endured, not in marble or decree, but in silence. A silence that belonged to the woman he could never outlive. Centuries drifted past, and yet her presence refused to die. The palace that once groaned under royal secrets had turned to ash, but her name began to surface again. Not in sermons or ledgers, but in the corners of forgotten libraries. Scholars uncovered fragments, a scrawled initial beneath the court ledger, a woman's likeness half effaced in a miniature painting. Each discovery seemed to breathe, as if the silence itself wanted to be broken. The people who found her were never the same. One archivist, sifting through Tudor correspondence, confessed that the inked pages grew damp beneath his hands, as though someone had wept upon them long before. Another researcher claimed she dreamt of candlelight glimmering over a ring she had never seen, yet could describe in perfect detail the next morning. What had been folklore turned into fascination. Ghost stories evolved into study. Historians began to ask questions the old chroniclers never dared. Who was she before the crown remade her? What voice had been silenced to protect a king's legend? The answers came in fragments. Letters torn in half, portraits scraped to blankness, a Latin prayer repeated in margins no one could translate fully. And then came the portrait. Hidden behind a painting of a saint, it showed a woman's face that matched no official record. Yet the eyes seemed unmistakably Tudor, proud, wounded, knowing too much. When the restoration was complete, witnesses swore they could feel a faint chill radiating from the oil itself, as though the pigment remembered grief. Each new revelation revived her shadow, not as a ghost haunting stone, but as a truth haunting history. The old corridors of power had collapsed, but her memory began to thread itself into the modern world. In whispered lectures, in candlelit exhibitions, in the slow click of cameras capturing the very thing time tried to erase. Visitors to the gallery often lingered before her image longer than before any other. Some said her gaze seemed to shift as the light changed, following them with a patience both tragic and defiant. Others felt nothing at all, just an ache, a sensation like standing too close to a storm that had already passed but left the air forever altered. Through every century, through every retelling, she found a way to exist again, not as a queen or a victim, but as an unanswered question. The empire that once silenced her had fallen into ruin, yet her story, fragile, incomplete, and uninvited, endured. And perhaps that was her final triumph, to remain when the king, His court and his glory were all reduced to dust. Her voice, once stifled by fear, now murmured softly through the archives of time, a reminder that history never buries guilt completely. It only waits for someone brave enough to listen. Centuries later, her tale no longer stirs fear, only silence. Not the silence of suppression, but the kind that follows understanding. The gilded halls that once echoed with deceit are gone, their stones folded into the earth, yet the pattern of what happened there continues in quieter rooms, in hearts that crave power more than peace. Henry's crown, once dazzling with command, has become an artifact behind glass, its brilliance dulled by dust and the eyes of those who now know what it cost. They see more than jewels and authority. They see the toll of ambition, the ruin that comes when love becomes conquest. His triumphs, his pageantry, all of it seems smaller beside the shadow of the woman he tried to erase. She, who began as a whisper at court, has turned into something he could never control, a symbol of memory's defiance. While he sought legacy through sons and thrones, hers came through persistence, the unkillable echo of injustice. In the end, the truth endured not through bloodlines, but through those who kept searching for her name in torn parchment and fading ink. If you listen closely, her lesson isn't vengeance, it's recognition. Power built on silence always unravels. Every empire that forgets its victims, sooner or later, faces their return, not as ghosts, but as truths refusing to fade. Her story is a warning etched across centuries. That obsession, when crowned, becomes cruelty. That affection, when warped by fear, breeds ruin. Some say her presence still lingers where her portrait hangs. Not as a haunting, but as a reminder, a gaze that asks whether humanity has learned. Visitors pause, drawn not by terror, but by something gentler, the quiet weight of understanding. They realize the monsters of history were not born of darkness alone, but of people who believed themselves righteous. And so her story ends, not with screams or fire, but with a single, enduring question. How many times will we let history repeat itself, dressed again in gold and ceremony? The air grows still. The candles gutter. Her face fades into shadow. But her truth remains, patient, watching, unforgotten.